Hello and welcome to Westferry Times. I'm Emily Carter, and today we're embarking on a deep dive into something that, well, it sounds a bit like science fiction, doesn't it? But it's very real. We're talking about China's embedded microchips potentially hidden within UK infrastructure. Are there hidden back doors built into the systems we rely on every day, our power, our internet? How real is this threat, actually? And what can even be done about it? To help us unpack all of this, we're joined by Dr. Marcus Linwood. He's a leading expert in cybersecurity and geopolitical analysis, and he's advised both the UK government and NATO on exactly these kinds of risks, foreign tech, in our critical infrastructure. Dr. Linwood, thank you for watching Westferry Times, and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Emily. It's a really important topic. Glad to be here to discuss it.
Great. Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. When we talk about embedded microchips in this context, what exactly are we dealing with? Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So think of these embedded microchips as very specialized, tiny computer components. They're not like the main processor in your computer. They're built directly into the hardware. We're talking things like the routers managing internet traffic, servers storing data, or those industrial control unit SCADA systems that manage really critical stuff.
Like power grids and water.
Exactly. Power grids, water treatment, traffic lights, the backbone systems. Now, the concern is, if these tiny chips are compromised, maybe during design, maybe during manufacturing, they can essentially become hidden pathways, secret routes for data to leak out, or for malicious instructions to come in.
Right. So these aren't chips you can just, see or easily swap out. They're baked right in, hidden.
Precisely. They're integral, often invisible to the average user, even to many system administrators, unless they're specifically looking at a very deep hardware level. And that invisibility, that's what makes them such a subtle and persistent potential threat. A compromised chip could just sit there dormant for years.
Waiting for some kind of trigger.
Potentially, yes. Triggered under specific conditions, making them incredibly hard to find with normal security scans. It's a kind of hidden potential espionage tool.
Okay, so how did we get here? How did China become so dominant in making these components that they might end up in, UK infrastructure?
Well, it wasn't an overnight thing. Over the last couple of decades, China really focused on becoming a kind of global powerhouse for electronics manufacturing. It was driven by various factors: lower costs, huge production capacity, government support, a whole mix.
So UK companies started relying on them.
Yes, many UK companies across loads of sectors found it made economic sense to source components made or assembled in China. It's just the reality of global supply chains, really. Scale and cost are huge drivers.
And this isn't necessarily about intentional sabotage from the start in every case. It's more about the reliance itself creating an opening.
That's a really important point. Often it's just economics. But that dependence, it inherently creates a risk. Even if a vulnerability isn't put there deliberately, if one exists perhaps from a design flaw or a manufacturing shortcut, that vulnerability could potentially be exploited later by someone with malicious intentions. The dependency is the doorway for the risk.
We have heard reports over the years, haven't we? Allegations about hardware being tampered with. Is there anything specific that stands out?
Yes, there have been several. Probably the most famous or infamous was the 2018 Bloomberg report about supermicro motherboards. It alleged these tiny, unauthorized chips were found on server motherboards, potentially for espionage.
Right, I remember that causing quite a stir.
It really did. Now, that specific report, its claims were heavily disputed by the companies involved and even some government agencies. But the impact was huge. It triggered serious investigations globally. The UK definitely took notice and looked into it. So whether that specific case was accurate or not, it absolutely shone a spotlight on the potential for this kind of hardware tampering, made it a real concern.
Okay, so given that risk, where should we be most concerned here in the UK? Which sectors are most exposed?
Well, there are three areas that usually come up first. Telecoms is a big one. Obviously, Huawei's past involvement in 5G and broadband infrastructure has put that sector under intense scrutiny.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, the energy sector. Those SCADA systems we mentioned, controlling power grids, potentially containing foreign components, that's a major concern. The potential impact is enormous. And third, you've got defense contractors. Even components in things like drones or surveillance gear, if they come from certain sources, could introduce vulnerabilities into sensitive systems.
And is the government trying to get a handle on this? Are they mapping out where these risks might lie?
Yes, the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Center, they're actively working on this, conducting audits, trying to understand the landscape of these components in critical infrastructure.
But it sounds like a massive job.
Oh, it is. It's incredibly complex. Think about the sheer number of devices out there, plus all the older legacy systems still in use. It's like trying to map every single wire in a giant old building. It's a huge ongoing challenge.
So let's talk about the worst case scenarios. If these chips are compromised, what are the actual dangers? What could happen?
Broadly, you're looking at three main categories of threat. First, data exfiltration. The chip secretly copies sensitive data flowing to the device and sends it off somewhere else.
Stealing secrets, essentially.
Pretty much. Second, cyber sabotage. This is the one that really worries people. The idea of a hidden kill switch.
A kill switch. To do what?
To disable critical infrastructure. Imagine shutting down parts of the power grid or disrupting communications, maybe during a crisis. It could be triggered remotely at a crucial moment.
This sounds terrifying.
It is a very serious concern. And the third threat is persistent surveillance, just quietly monitoring activity over the long term, undetected, gathering intelligence constantly.
And like you said earlier, the scary part is you might not even know it's happening.
Exactly. It can be completely silent, operating in the background. You wouldn't know there's a problem until the attacker decides to, well, act.
Yeah.
Until it's potentially too late.
So, faced with these kinds of risks, what has the UK government actually done? What's the official response?
The main legislative action has been the Telecommunications Security Act, which came in 2021. That act gives regulators, Ofcom, and the NCSC much stronger powers. They can set strict security rules for telecom equipment vendors, they can audit them, enforce standards, and crucially, they have the power to designate suppliers as high risk.
Which is what happened with Huawei, right?
Yes, exactly. The act provides the legal basis for demanding that high-risk vendors, most notably Huawei, be removed from the UK's 5G networks. The deadline for that removal is set for 2027.
But that 2027 date, that's been controversial, hasn't it? Some say it's too slow.
It has, yes. There's definitely debate. Critics argue the security risks mean it should happen faster. But the government and operators point to the complexity and cost, ripping out and replacing core infrastructure across the country without causing major disruption. Well, it takes time and a lot of money. It's a balancing act, though some argue security should trump the practicalities here.
Let's shift to the business world. How aware are UK companies about this? Especially those outside the really big critical sectors.
Awareness is, let's say it's growing, but it's uneven. Your large multinationals, especially in energy, finance, telecoms, they tend to be more clued in. They have dedicated security teams looking at supply chain risk.
But smaller firms.
It varies. Many smaller and medium-sized businesses, unfortunately, still tend to see cybersecurity as more of a kind of compliance thing, an IT problem maybe, not necessarily a core strategic risk that could affect their fundamental operations or make them a gateway into bigger systems.
So it's not just a government problem then. Businesses have a big role.
Absolutely not just government. The supply chain is interconnected.
Right.
A smaller contractor may be working on a project for a big utility company. If their systems have a vulnerability, maybe from a compromised component in their office server, that could potentially provide an attacker with a foothold into the larger, more critical network. Every link matters.
We hear the term de-risking a lot now in geopolitics. Can you explain what that means here and how it's different from, say, decoupling?
Sure. Decoupling is the more extreme idea, basically trying to completely separate economies and tech supply chains, cutting ties altogether. Most people think that's, well, largely impractical in our globalized world and potentially very damaging economically. De-risking is more nuanced. It means you don't necessarily cut ties, but you actively work to reduce the risks by doing things like diversifying your suppliers, so you're not overly reliant on one country or company, by demanding more transparency. Where did this component really come from? What checks has it undergone? And by building up more domestic capability in critical areas. It's about managing the dependency, reducing vulnerability without triggering, economic collapse.
And is that the path the UK is generally taking? De-risking?
It seems that way, yes.
Yeah.
The UK, along with allies like the US, Australia, others in the Five Eyes network, the strategy appears to be focused on de-risking from potentially adversarial states like China, particularly in sensitive tech areas.
Driven partly by pressure from those allies, too, presumably.
Oh, certainly. There's a lot of coordination and shared concern among allies about these supply chain vulnerabilities. The U.S. has been particularly vocal. It's about balancing security needs with economic reality.
So looking forward, what should we expect next? What are the next steps or likely developments in this whole area?
Well, I think we'll see a few things intensify. First, probably more audits, more detailed assessments of critical infrastructure, trying to get a clearer picture of what hardware is actually in there.
Right.
Second, expect a much bigger focus on hardware transparency and provenance. Proving where components came from and that they're secure. Maybe like a secure origin label for hardware.
Like we have for food sometimes.
Sort of, yeah, but for tech components. Third, stronger alliances between democracies on secure technology development and supply chains, trying to build trusted alternatives. And finally, unfortunately, I think it's likely we'll discover more vulnerabilities that were previously unnoticed. As we look harder, we'll probably find more things that need fixing.
So this isn't really a problem you solve and then move on from. It's an ongoing state of vigilance.
Absolutely. The cyber landscape is constantly shifting. Technology evolves, threats evolve, and the security of the actual hardware, the physical chips and components, is becoming just as critical as software security. It's a fundamental part of the equation now.
Dr. Marcus Linwood, thank you. That was incredibly insightful and definitely gives us a lot to think about. It really highlights how modern security is about so much more than just locks on doors. It goes right down to the tiny chips inside the technology we depend on.
My pleasure, Emily. It's a crucial conversation, and it needs to keep happening.
Indeed. And thank you to all of you for listening and joining us on Westferry Times. We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer perspective on the risks and responses around embedded microchips. If you found it useful, please do consider subscribing to Westferry Times, maybe share it with someone else who might be interested, and leaving a review always helps. Until our next deep dive, stay informed, stay secure, and as always, stay curious.